This episode was recorded on the unceded lands of the Kulin Nation.
Hello, and welcome to POSLink Plus Listen. My name's Jen. In this episode, it's a follow-on from the last episode where we heard from Steph Raper. This is Tex McKenzie delivering his address from the 40th anniversary of the Candlelight Memorial. So Tex sat with us, he gave his speech again and then kindly chatted in more detail about his experience of creating his address, as well as sharing many memories of working tirelessly in the HIV sector over many, many years. So it was such a joy to sit down with Tex. I hope you enjoy our conversation.
"40 years ago, in early 1985, Phil Carswell had read about an AIDS memorial happening in the USA. He phoned his friend Tom Carter and said they should do something about it here. Two of our community, Tom Carter and the late Phil Carswell, stood together under an umbrella. It was Melbourne, with winter approaching and a rainy late afternoon in May. City workers hurried past on their way home and would barely have noticed two friends under an umbrella, each holding a candle, standing there, remembering those who had already died. Friends, perhaps colleagues, patients, family of birth, family of choice, or lovers perhaps, but those here already dead and those dying from the, at the time, a not too well understood start to our pandemic. I'm so grateful I rang Tom Carter to confirm it was just him and Phil that night at the first of what would later become the Melbourne AIDS Memorial Candlelight Vigil, known now as the AIDS Candlelight Memorial, organised for us each year by Living Positive Victoria. Tom and his husband Steve recalled so many vigil years of memories. Each year for me, this memorial is there as an important addition to memorials that mean something to me, like the Anzac Dawn Service, Ida Hobbit, World AIDS Day, and of course, Remembrance Day. On Remembrance Day, I wear a red poppy. Today, I wear my red ribbon, the uniquely Victorian red ribbon. I began as a volunteer in 1989 with the then Victorian AIDS Council, Gay Men's Health Centre, now Thorn Harbour Health, our host today in this beautiful building. I was subsequently employed for 32 years and have worked on short-term contracts more recently. I actually worked there so long that remembering history wasn't always welcomed. Also, in 1989, I joined the committee of the Vigil, having been invited along to a meeting by Tom Carter. We know that first vigil was 2 people. Then there were dozens of dozens, and then it went to hundreds and eventually thousands, turning up each year on a cold, almost winter early evening. Sometimes raining. After all, it is almost winter in Melbourne, always chilly, but hordes of people buying the candles that helped fund the event. Organisations and community groups held banners aloft, and others sometimes a cardboard sign with a name or names on it. Listening to the reading out of the names of people lost to HIV/AIDS, until quickly, over a few years, they became too many to read out. As HIV affected so many in the arts communities, it wasn't too difficult to arrange to get a local performer, and I know someone will remember if it was maybe Deborah Byrne once and possibly Marsha Hines. So many volunteered to perform each year, like now with the low-res male choir joining us each year. Tom reminded me of many shared memories, including that there had been a video made on a VHS tape, remember them? It ran just 20 seconds, that played in the pubs, in between video clips, and between movies in the sex venues. People shared that this helped in part for people grieving lost loved ones, because in the gay and lesbian community, as we called it then, now of course LGBTIQ+ community, everyone seemed to know at least one person affected by HIV/AIDS. And here there was advertised somewhere that was a space set aside to let us mourn and remember. We didn't always get invited or informed of funerals, so this night was when we could come together to remember the love, to remember their names. Eventually, we were lucky to have a destination, that is, somewhere to march to. Sometimes somewhere outside, but increasingly to somewhere inside, where we could witness magic as the panels of the sadly ever-growing AIDS Memorial quilt were unfolded before our eyes. And we saw old friends again, and we could cry and be safe together. My first vigil was 1990, I think. One of those nights we gathered on that plaza-type area above Flinders Street, platform 14. I'm semi-sure Central Station Records was on street level. We marched across Princes Bridge to the Great Hall at the National Gallery of Victoria for the unfolding of the then small but again ever-growing AIDS Memorial quilt. It was the only year that great space could accommodate the vigil crowd and the unfolded quilts. Then I think around 1994 we had possibly the largest crowd ever, numbering into the many, many thousands. The police guesstimated around 20,000, so you can be sure it was more, as they always underquoted numbers at our community events. As in anything involving a march, some of the committee had rushed from the exhibition building where we'd been preparing all day to coordinate the actual vigil starting point with selling candles, organising the speakers, and eventually herding people along Swanson Street and up Burke Street. The rest of the committee and other volunteers were putting the finishing touches together for the arrival of that crowd and the eventual quilt unfolding at the Royal Exhibition Building. I'd been employed that year on a project for the City of Melbourne that sourced and employed a musician and lyricist to write a candlelight vigil song for the gay and lesbian chorus and others to perform at the quilt unfolding. If you like, now could be a time to light your candles. Just a flick of a switch these days with no messy wax. On that night, our lookout person called out for everyone to come and see. Viewing from the huge side doors of the exhibition building, we looked down into the Carlton Gardens and, I'll never forget it, we saw a river of light flowing towards us. There were the usual city noises in the background, but the procession of people was silent. The candles and the banners told the story. Tom also reminded me of the year that Joan Kirner, the then State Premier of Victoria, together with Caroline Hogg, then Health Minister, wanted to join in the vigil and march. However, Joan Kirner wanted to be just one of the crowd, saying on the night, when asked by a concerned police officer, that if she wasn't safe amongst this crowd, she shouldn't be the Premier of Victoria. So together they marched with us, with no security, everything low-key, just other people remembering their lost friends with everyone else. And here I'd like to acknowledge and thank Melbourne City Council, who helped by making the City Square and other spaces available back then for the vigil, and Victoria Police, who helped with the crowd and traffic control. And here with us tonight, Colin Chrysler, who has lit our events and made sure that the microphones work. The early funding came from the chequebook of Robbie Quigg, one of the owners of Porter Street Sauna. Later, when Jan Hillier ruled the committee, Tom reminded me that not a cent of donated or fundraised money went unrecorded, to the very cent. She knew business. Both Jan, together with Doug Lucas, also dug deep into the till from their Sunday night show called Pokies at the Prince of Wales. As a volunteer committee, we had a variety of meeting spaces over the years, including the meeting rooms at VAC, spare rooms at Fairfield Hospital when available, and rooms at Trades Hall in Carlton. And I want to acknowledge the union movement who stood with us at protests and at our vigils. Our always available go-to meeting space was the coffee lounge of that gay male sauna, the aforementioned Porter Street sauna in Paran, no longer there and now a public park. We were a community group meeting in a community space with patrons in towels offering suggestions. I was so awed by Jan Hillier, a legend in our community, but soon got to know her. Jan knew how to run a business and a meeting, moving us promptly on to the next agenda item. The amount in the bank was suddenly more secure, allowing for longer forward planning. New people to the committee would soon learn you can have fun as you plan an event that will touch so many. Dark humour, being a friend during difficult times. Attendances at the vigils dwindled over the years, coinciding with other events starting, but we still had this time together. I stopped going for a while, and then someone, I think, from Living Positive Victoria told me a friend was speaking that year and invited me back. And perhaps it was the night Bill O'Loughlin spoke. I remember that night it was wet and windy on the banks of the Yarra at South Bank. The only plus, the electronic candles didn't blow out. I want to end with a quote I found shared on social media earlier this year by two friends and former VAC colleagues, Kenton and Paul. It resonated with me as I was thinking about what to write for tonight. There was so much. It's by the American author, some may have heard of him, Dan Savage. He wrote, "During the darkest days of the AIDS crisis, we buried our friends in the morning. We protested in the afternoon and we danced all night. The dance kept us in the fight because it was the dance we were fighting for. It didn't look like we were going to win then, and we did. It doesn't feel like we're going to win now, but we could. Keep fighting, keep dancing. Remember the love, remember their names." Thank you.
Well, thank you, Tex. You gave such a beautiful address on the occasion of the 40th anniversary of that very first candlelight vigil. The theme was "Don't Forget to Remember." Thank you so much. I'm very pleased that you're happy to dig a little bit deeper into that speech or address.
Sure.
Tex. So can I first ask you, what was it like for you to prepare that speech and reflect on the theme as we marked 40 years since that night in the rain?
Well, of course, I wasn't there the night in the rain. And it's funny about remembering because immediately I started to remember all different sorts of things. And that's when I rang Tom Carter, I rang Tom. He's now retired, living in the country with his husband, who hasn't yet retired. And I just wanted to, because I had read something somewhere that described, I think it was when Phil Carswell died, and someone had written there where the event had happened. And this was so confusing to me because I remembered in the very early days of the meetings of the vigil how that first vigil had been described to me. And I was being given two different origin places, if you like, in the city, sure. A lot of people remember the first vigil as being on the plaza area, which is now where Federation Square is.
Yep.
So there was a raised plaza above platform 14, which obviously underneath. And I remember my first vigil started from there, about I think the 1990 vigil. But there are a heck of a lot of people out there who have said that the first vigil happened there. But it wasn't. It was actually in the city square, which is about to be reborn now that the
Town Hall Station.
Wretched Town Hall Station is going to open after those almost seems like a decade of the being crossed off. But it's where the city square, or we used to call the city rectangle, used to be. And that's the thing. They were standing an umbrella in the rain in the city square, which is on ground level. So the hurrying crowds walking past in the rain, barely noticing them, It made sense when Steve said that, well, he was there because he'd driven Tom in, and he was standing off to the side because it was the two friends under the umbrella. They had both decided to have just this memorial, if you like. They talked in America, of course, it's in summer, or the lead up to summer. So having a candlelight memorial is no problem because it's not cold. You'll get heaps of people out. But here in Melbourne, well, it started off with just the two of them in the city square, and Steve recalled it because people had come over to him and said, well, what's this all about? And he said, well, it's a memorial to the people who died of AIDS. And, of course, a lot of people hadn't heard of the term. I think it was being called AIDS at the time. It might have been still been HLTV3 or the gay plague, as a lot of people dreadfully referred to it. But, yeah, so he could do a little bit of education, if you like, with those people. And so it's really funny because in the lead up to the 40th anniversary, when I said I'd been invited to give one of the keynote addresses, someone had said, that's really interesting. You'll have to mention me. I was there. And I'm thinking to myself, no, you won't. Maybe you were off to the side because you were good friends with Tom and Steve, but you weren't there at the very first vigil because it was two people. But the next vigil, I'm aware, had, well, dozens or
many
a couple of dozen people, and from that it kept on growing bigger and bigger and bigger. So, there was a lot of, and of course it brought up all sorts of stuff about working from Thorn Harbour now, but at the time when I was employed it was Victorian AIDS Council, and all of those days of mass mobilisations of volunteers from across the community. It wasn't just gay and lesbian people, as we called the community at the time, who were doing that hands-on care and support. It was mums and dads and relatives and strangers and people with compassionate hearts, nuns, even Roman Catholic nuns who were doing the care work at the time and helping these organisations mobilise and get started. Of course, there was an organisation called the Also Foundation in the community, which were known for doing dance parties, and very quickly those dance parties became fundraisers for the new organisation, Victorian AIDS Action Committee, which became Victorian AIDS Council, then Victorian AIDS Council Gay Men's Health Centre. But, so there was already an organisation in the community which they did a lot of stuff for the HIV community, and especially for the Victorian AIDS Council when it was starting up. They gave the seeding money, if you like, when there was no government money, when it was volunteers putting in money.
So, you were given a time limit for your address. Was there anything you wished you'd been able to include, or anything else? Okay, give me one thing. What's the one thing that didn't make the cut? Because now's your chance, Tex.
Well, one thing was that first vigil that I went to, when the major emphasis was actually on the vigil part. The speeches, most of the speeches happened on that plaza. And then we marched for the unfolding of the quilts at the Great Hall in the National Gallery, and I don't think there were any speeches there. It was just music, and the quilts were ceremonially unfolded. And I was struck because I looked down at the quilts, and I don't know, there might have been only 2 or 3 blocks at the time, maybe 4 blocks of quilts. But I looked up at the ceiling and it was a Leonard French ceiling in the National Gallery, which is a stained glass ceiling. And it was because it's such a multitude of stained glass, it sort of looked a bit like the quilts underneath. So it was a great, if you like, not a reflection, it wasn't a mirror, but it was just one of those things that's always stuck in my mind. When I originally wrote my 10 minutes, it was 27, so I had to cut it down a lot. And this lost a place because I wanted to say something about those days, and I wanted to say something along the lines of that it will be a time that some people remember, I certainly do, of the dreadful days when there was enormous fear and ignorance, there was stigma and discrimination, and both of those, unfortunately, still exist, as I'm sure anyone from Living Positive would be able to tell you. It was when people thought AIDS could still be contracted from toilet seats or, from swimming in the same swimming pool, sharing crockery or eating utensils, or the really sad one, for my mind, when you could catch it by hugging someone, which was just absurd, of course. But at the time, a lot of people didn't know. And also that too often when people got really sick, they lost their independence. Back then, of course, they could lose their employment if people found out that they were HIV positive. Sometimes they could lose their homes. And that meant that when they had to go home to die, it often meant going back to places of birth to families who'd sometimes kicked them out of home when they'd come out. So these were parents or families that took them back but didn't actually want the friendship networks that their kids had developed, maybe in the big city. Didn't want these people to visit them or even to attend a funeral. And as I said in my address, sometimes we didn't get to go to the funeral, so the vigil for us became the funeral that we didn't get to go to.
Thank you, Tex, and I hope that for all our listeners, next time we visit the National Gallery of Victoria, we can visit the stained glass ceiling and just recall that reflection of that great memorial quilt all those years ago. So, Tex, you have worked tirelessly in the HIV response since the early days. Can you reflect a little bit on your experience, and particularly thinking about the people who nowadays we might call allies in this response?
Okay. All right. Look, I came to volunteering, which means I came to being involved in the community, which at the time was just called the gay and lesbian community, and we didn't say the HIV community at the time. It was just if you said community, it meant everyone.
Yep.
So I came into it after an event that happened in my working life outside of the field. Some people with long memories may remember the Queen Street shooting in 1988 in the Australia Post Victorian headquarters. I was sort of involved with that, and I had to see a counsellor later. And eventually, after seeing him for about 6 months, when it was probably pretty obvious to him that I was going because he was quite gorgeous and I liked talking to him, that he said, look, I think our time has come, Tex. You should get involved in your community. You're gay. The gay community is going to be really affected by this AIDS thing, which has been happening. So maybe, see if you've got any links to getting into the community that way, because it's going to be really big. And I thought to myself, as soon as I got involved with the Victorian AIDS Council, it is big. It was huge. So, that got me to the Victorian AIDS Council, and then Tom got me along to the vigil by inviting me to one of the meetings. It was when the Victorian AIDS Council, as it was still a volunteer-controlled organisation. With nowhere near the financial resources. I think there'd been some initial funding from the government by that stage. But anyway, those early days when it was still volunteer controlled, everything had to happen with fundraise money, and that's why I mentioned Jan and Doug's venue, or night pokies on Sundays, which raised so much because the drag queens were quite often the people who were getting sick and who were disappearing, needing to be replaced by new would-be drag queens. There was great fundraising done by all across the community. The sex venues dug into the till because their patrons were disappearing. Robbie Quigg, who I mentioned, who was one of the owners of Porter Street Sauna, I'm not sure how many of the owners, and there were 11 owners, I think by the time effective treatments became available, there might have been 3 or 4 left. And their clients, the venues were supporting the community that they were a part of because the patrons were the people they could see. And sometimes with the visible lesions that would sometimes turn people away. There was a very effective HIV tool which was developed, I think, in Queensland, and it was a poster, I think an A2 size poster, which is double A3, and it was a mirrored surface. And across the top of the mirror, it had, on the top of this poster, it had a typical person with HIV, which meant, of course, that anyone who looked at the mirror could be a person living with HIV because, generally, how would you know?
There's no typical.
There's no typical. And the Laird Hotel sparked up a mini controversy when they put this poster on the outside of the door to the main toilets in the back bar. And I witnessed a group of people on the night that this poster had been put up during the day saying how bad it was that poster was there because it would marginalise positive people. It would out positive people. How a mirror would out positive people was beyond me. But anyway, it was a very interesting, and it was this conversation which was happening until it just happened to be someone I know, said, well, I don't have a problem with the poster. And they said, oh, well, so what? And he said, well, I'm positive and it looks like me. And if you were positive, it would look like you. But as you're negative, it looks like you. What it's saying is that anybody can have HIV. So look after yourself, because the bottom of the poster had something along the lines of use condoms and lube, because that was the technology at the time, the only technology we had at the time. It was just a really interesting interaction by people who were just punters in a pub. Who said, oh, this will make my friends not come. And then to have a couple of positive people say, well, and one of them was a barman who said, well, I actually think it's quite a great tool. And the funny thing was I had found this block of about 20 posters which had been purchased a couple of years before, but the person who ordered them didn't like them, so he'd hidden them behind a chest of drawers. I moved that chest of drawers one day and found the posters and thought they should be out. So we got them out. And they got people talking, and that was part of the thing we wanted to do at the time, was to get people talking.
As you're talking, I'm reflecting also on, I asked for reflections on allies and the role of allies, and, that scenario that you describe of essentially people feeling uncomfortable with HIV prevention, HIV awareness messaging, and that it is actually the role of allies to step in, because for positive people that shouldn't be necessarily their jobs. It's everybody's job to actually call out what was really HIV stigma. And also shout out to the Laird. Allies since the beginning and continue to be really, really important for us as an organisation. They host our Planet Positive parties, and so that is really, really powerful story. I like the old health promotion campaigns. There just wasn't quite anything like them we were talking before. So Tex, really a breathtaking but brief description in your address about the candlelight vigil that year at the exhibition building. You paint a picture of 20,000 people, a sea.
Well, we thought it was 30,000.
Yeah, as it probably was.
Because it probably was because Victoria Police always tended to underestimate. I remember lots of different rallies for lots of different reasons outside of LGBTIQ plus HIV spaces where if they didn't like the crowd, they always said it was just a few, but you could look back and down a city block and see them turning around the corner from Swanson Street and you think, oh, no, this is a big crowd. We used the exhibition building and we were lucky to use the exhibition building. It cost a lot back then to rent the building. For one day, it was something like $18,000, and this was back in the early 90s. And it was one of those cases where someone knew someone who probably had slept with someone. But we managed to get the 18,000 knocked down to 2,000, and instead of one day, we could have it on bumping in on the Friday night and bumping out by midnight Sunday.
Wow!
So you could have a 2-day exhibition where people could come during the day if they didn't want to take part at night in the big public demonstration of marching with candles. They could come during the day and just see the quilts that were all set out. Oh,
wow. Okay.
And so there were boxes of tissues aplenty where you went through boxes of tissues because at every block you needed at least 2 packets of tissues. And the blocks of quilts, and this will sound really strange, but the quilt measured 3 foot by 6 foot because that was the size of a grave. Yep. The quilt got too big for the exhibition, even for the exhibition buildings, which was sad. And eventually, too big for it to be laid out so that people could walk around it when it was laid out. So eventually, these massive big blocks of quilt were hung from the internal balconies of the exhibition building, so that when there were people ceremoniously unfolding the quilts so that people could see them, they would be hung up half again so that the ropes could be let down and the quilts could be unfolded as they flowed down the walls or from the balconies. There were too many quilts, and it was...
And that's a big space.
And that is a big space.
And, I'm thinking now there's a lot of effort that goes into the preservation of these quilts as these important memorial and historical pieces. The Melbourne quilt is one of many quilts in the world. Have you ever seen any of the other quilts from other parts of the world,
Tex? I have indeed. That's a great lead into an event that happened at the exhibition buildings. I think it was that 1994 exhibition of the quilts.
Right.
We had... it was the height, if you like, of the memorials, and we hadn't got too big for our boots. But what we decided to do was to invite countries around the world that had quilt projects to send a representative quilt or quilts so that they could be displayed at this big official opening. I think it was the Lord Mayor who spoke, or maybe the Health Minister, Caroline Hogg. I'm not sure who it was who spoke, but we got quilts from all over the world, so from Japan, from New Zealand, across the ditch, but also from the UK, some from the USA, but some smaller places. I think there was one from Papua New Guinea. It might have been the first quilt from Papua New Guinea. But these were unfolded with the rest of the quilts, the Australian quilts. And, of course, I say the Australian quilts because you did mention the Melbourne quilt or the Victorian quilt is held by Thorn Harbour Health, because the rest of the Australian quilt is in the Powerhouse Museum in New South Wales. And when it was handed over by ACON to the Powerhouse Museum, there was a block of the Victorian quilt in there. Okay. And glory be, thank you to Jack Hall at Thorn Harbour Health, who argued it out of the Powerhouse Museum, and it is now back with the Victorian quilt. But there are a couple of separate quilts they couldn't get back, which are parted. And it's in a museum, great, it's being cared for, but people hardly ever get to see it. It trot out a few blocks for World AIDS Day, you know.
And was it your connects at Australia Post that facilitated the transportation of
No. As I said, with the exhibition buildings where someone knew someone, there was always a Qantas queen that someone knew. And these quilts were flown on Qantas planes or like-minded airlines from those countries to Melbourne for the display and sent back for no charge.
Fantastic.
So it was just one of those. I mean, obviously, airline stewards, a lot of them were same-sex attracted or community connected. There's a good line. So, of course, they were working behind the scenes to get these things done. And they got done because people knew. You know, you knew each other and stuff. It's a bit like the I mentioned the uniquely Victorian red ribbon designed by a Melbourne Qantas steward.
Right, okay.
Brent Lacey. If you think of the international red ribbon, which will be most ribbons that you've ever seen, whatever the colour happens to be, red is the first one, which of course was the AIDS ribbon, was the first ribbon, or the HIV AIDS ribbon. He saw these ribbons in New York, and they were the ribbon with the loop at the top.
Yep.
And he thought, oh, this is a good idea. Raise some money for VAC, Victorian AIDS Council, David Williams Fund, the fund that they have for positive people, supporting positive people. So he brought the idea back and he got a roll of ribbon, toyed around with it and thought, well, if he got rid of the loop at the top, he'd make more ribbons per roll. More ribbons that people could pin onto themselves. So the ribbon looks a bit like an upside-down V, and it's cut so that it looks like two legs are walking with the line that they're walking towards a cure. And that one day our uniquely Victorian red ribbon will be able to be turned upside down. So it will no longer be legs walking towards a cure, but a V for victory over HIV.
Nice.
So that's
I like that.
In a nutshell.
Yeah. Thank you, Tex. So the last thing I guess I want to reflect on is that both yourself and another keynote speaker, Steph, you landed on sharing the same Dan Savage quote, and for good reason. It's a really powerful quote, and I think it's a quote that has been used in conversations about these kinds of memorials once or twice. It talks about grief. It talks about activism. It talks about dancing. And so I'm just wondering if you can talk a bit about how dancing and laughter and, you know, you mentioned dark humour in your speech. You know, how have they been a part of the grieving and the mourning and the remembering?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, it's funny. I ended my address with that quote and then Steph started hers immediately and I thought, oh, no, deja vu. And she laughed and said, oh, I've chosen it too and I'm starting with it. And it was important because, it sets it out, the funerals and the activism but the fact that you had to celebrate. You had to celebrate. And this was a big thing. I knew this guy, Robbie Quigg, who had been the owner of the sauna, and he became quite well known to me because we used to have those meetings, as I said, at the sauna, and it was so funny to see all the tables pushed together in the coffee lounge and the chairs put round, and Jan Hillier, and she described herself as a dyke, a butch dyke. So the butch dyke at the top of the table.
Was she wearing a towel?
I know. This was the thing. Everyone else was waddling around with the towel, as in always with the sauna. Most of them were in the middle, the bold ones with it over their shoulder. But, and they were offering suggestions, which were sometimes welcome, but usually weren't. But Robbie, I used to see Robbie Quigg, and he was relatively, by that stage, which is the mid-90s, he was still digging his hands in the till to help pay for the vigils to happen back then. But I always saw him out and about, and I thought, isn't that great? I was a negative man, where I can get out and about and have a great time. If I was positive, and like Robbie was, and he was obviously sick a lot of the time, he always made sure he went to the vigil. And I don't know if it's because of that really sad thing that someone I heard once said, the saddest comment that I heard at a vigil was someone who said, "Make sure you remember me next year." Now, Robbie made sure, like a lot of people, that he got out and lived life to the full. So every dance party could be his last dance party. And I recently heard Joe Ball, the LGBTIQ Victorian Commissioner, refer to some events like Gay Christmas as a gay Christmas. And dance parties were sort of like that. I mean, people went to Mardi Gras, and in Sydney they call it Gay Christmas. But our Gay Christmas, if you like, was our big dance party in summer, which was Red Raw, and another one at Queen's birthday called Winter Days. And then they started to multiply. But Robbie was always there, and even when he couldn't dance and when he couldn't sit comfortably in the horrible wooden bleachers, he'd take a cushion with us. You know, we'd take cushions for him to sit on. But he was always there, and he got sicker and sicker. Like his patrons and like the people he knew and like the people that we interacted with, sometimes someone wasn't there anymore. And you could guess why, and it wasn't always the case, but quite often it was. But, you know, the dancing bit was really important. I loved going dancing. I go to the Laird, then the Peel for a dance, and the Club 80 for usually a joint upstairs. But I mean, you know, if you want to picture the moment, go back to 1990s, go into a search engine and look for the top 10 disco hits, and you will see the songs and hear the voices that dragged us to the dance floor and wouldn't let us stop, you know, and you could see people who shouldn't be dancing, they're dancing, celebrating, because it was Christmas, time to celebrate. And there was a really fun thing I remember. Rachel Berger, she wrote a novel back at this time when Fairfield Hospital was when they were threatening to close Fairfield Hospital, which was a place that so many of us went to, whether we were caring for people or whether they were the people who were in the hospital. And she wrote a book which is really good. It was the title is "What Do You Mean You're Allergic to Rubber?" And she she used to do all sorts of fundraising for HIV, and a lot of it was the Laird auction. But the very first time she appeared at the Laird Hotel, predominantly the back bar of the Laird Hotel, jam-packed predominantly with men, and she appeared on the stage and she was wearing a red sequin top and some smart spandex pants, and she had her hair all woofied up and gorgeous earrings. And she was in the middle of her routine, and all of a sudden from the back of a room, a voice called out, "Take off your top." And she looked around, really confused, looked at the gay and bisexual men, predominantly gay men in front of her. And she said, "You want to see my tits?" And the voice came back, "No, we want the top." She laughed and we laughed, and that's how sometimes you had to get your laugh, you know, it was that sort of thing.
Yeah, beautiful. Look, thank you so much, Tex, for coming in to talk to us today, not just to talk a little bit more about your beautiful speech at the Candlelight Memorial, but also for helping to kind of preserve your memories and to preserve these stories in this conversation. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Cheers. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of POSLink Plus Listen. You can find more episodes on our website or wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure you subscribe to stay up to date. And for all the latest news, events and resources from us, head to lpv.org.au and join us on our social channels.